Chapter 16. Isabella was asleep on her little pallet on the floor. Peter was tucked into the big bed. Maggie stepped over to the bed, and Peter's gaze drifted to her.
"Where's Keith?"
Oh. The question took her off guard, and she glanced back at the door. I'm here, Keith said, pushing the door to gently. You didn't think I'd miss prayers, did you? Maggie couldn't get all the emotions lined up in logical order in her heart. It would have all been so easy if he had just not been Keith Ayer. And minus the hat and the bandana, it was hard not to notice that he was. Pushing those thoughts away, at the bed she knelt on one side, and her heart flipped over when Keith knelt on the other. He reached across the mattress for her hand, and with her heart doing somersaults through her, she laid her hand in his. Strength and safety flooded through her spirit as he held her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckle. Praying under these conditions was more than she could do. Just to get a word out was impossible. Closing her eyes, she willed her mind to stay with her. Dear Lord, please be with us tonight. Keep us safe and help us all have a good night's sleep. Please keep all the boys and girls in the world safe and help them all to have a good night. Amen. The two amens blended together, and they yanked tears to her eyes. She sniffed them back and pushed up to her feet. Anchoring her gaze on Peter, she smiled lest it betray her by following Keith up and around the bed. Get some sleep. Peter nodded and snuggled down into the covers. She put her fingers to her lips, kissed them, and put them on his forehead. Good night, sweet prince. She was careful not to trip on Isabella on her way to the door where Keith was already waiting. Ducking, she stepped past him and out into the hall. Her steps took her to the door of her room. Spending more time with him than she had to was dangerous to her heart and to her sanity. You going to bed? He asked, sounding strangely disappointed. She had her arm anchored to her middle. I'd better if we're going to get to church tomorrow. He looked as if he was going to protest, but he just nodded. Okay, see you in the morning. As absurd as it sounded, Maggie was a little disappointed he didn't stop her. But then, that was nuts. She went into her room and pulled her little duffel bag from the floor. The only piece of clothing she had bought on her disaster of a shopping trip was a decent pair of pajamas. She pulled them and the matching robe out of the bag and put them on. The soft blue satin slid across her skin. How life had changed in the last month. Ready for bed, she climbed into the low-rise sleigh bed. Her prayers slid through her with no effort. Her parents, Mrs. Malinowski, the kids, the Ayers, and then his name, as it always did, found its way into her mind. God, please help me find a guy as nice as Keith. That's all I ask. She laid there, replaying the evening in her mind. Start to finish, it had been perfect. Her mind traced over Peter and Izzy sleeping in a strange house, and concern drifted through her. Peter wasn't the most tranquil child on the planet. He probably hadn't slept outside his own room 10 nights since he'd been alive. She had this horrible vision of him lying there all night, listening to the scary sounds of a strange house as she had in each new home she slept in when she was a child. And he would do that too, lie there all night, scared out of his mind and never come get her. That was the kind of kid he was. She listened to the sounds in the house to see if Keith was awake. However, the hum of the dishwasher was the only one. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs out of the bed and grabbed her robe. It wouldn't hurt to check on Peter once more. She went to the door and slid it open. She looked up and down the hall. Nothing. A step, and she was in the hallway. 2 more, and she was at the children's door, her hand securing her robe at her stomach. Softly, she twisted the knob and pushed it open. So she wouldn't have to risk making noise to get it open again, she left it ajar an inch and stepped into the room. Isabella, thumb in mouth, lay on the floor. Her little eyes were closed with the dreams behind them. Maggie smiled at the sight. Then she stepped twice more and found Peter, too, already asleep. To her, that could only mean one thing, that he felt as safe here as she did. That thought slid through her. Grateful tears swept over her heart. Peter deserved to feel safe. They all did. She let her hand brush the comforter as she turned, intending to head back to the door, but the glow at the window stopped her. Intrigued, she stepped over to it, trying to determine the origin of the soft glow in the nighttime sky. The thought hit her. The party. Yes, it would be going on up on the hill beyond. The break in the yard trees allowed the glow to be visible only in pieces, but it was there just the same. Thoughts and memories swarmed through Maggie, and she pulled her arms to her chest to deflect them. One hand rubbed slowly up the other arm as she stood there, lost in yesterday, gazing into it as if it was right there in front of her. Keith was on his way back to his room from getting a drink when he noticed that the kid's door wasn't shut. That was odd. His first thought was Peter. Maybe he had already gotten scared and had gone to find someone to make it better. However, with a glance, he realized that Maggie's door was shut tight. Something wasn't right, but he decided to check it out before he bothered her. With the lightest touch on the kid's door, it opened, and there in the pale light of the window stood Maggie. The waves of hair, the curves, there was no one else it could be. His heart snagged on the sight. There was something so intimate about it, as if she knew no one knew she was there. For a moment he thought about leaving before she knew he was there, but then he heard the soft sniff of overwhelming ache, and concern traced through him. Wanting not to scare her, but to help just the same, he stepped into the room and over to where she stood. "Maggie?" She turned to him, and the anguish in her eyes overtook his heart with the hard whack of a 2x4 across the chest. Her face contorted, and she closed her eyes, squeezing them to stop the pain. But it squeezed out tears instead. They rolled down her cheeks on the paths others had already made. "Maggie, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. The words seemed to jam without ever making it to the air. It was all he could think to do. "Hey, shh, come here." He pulled her into his arms and vowed to hold her there until all the tears were vanquished. Maggie knew she should pull away. It wasn't right for her to be here in his arms, soaking in his strength as her grief poured out of her heart. But the truth was, she needed him right now, more than she had ever needed anyone. The memories were too much for her to bear alone. They were too heavy and too overwhelming. So many nights spent thinking about the one that had changed hers forever. So many days spent trying not to think about it. With her head on his chest, she let her tear-blurred gaze drift out to that glow in the night sky beyond the trees, and the grief hit again. She pulled her hand to her mouth, trying to get her brain to stop thinking. The tears were going to drag her down until she might not get to the top of them again. Still, gently, solidly he stood, just holding her and letting her grief run its course. Her thoughts bounced back and forth from present to past as waves of anguish gushed over her. It was a night just like this one, early spring. It was a party just like that one, the social event of the season. The man, she'd never had a name for him, just the man. He had partied, and then he left and changed her life forever. Sorrow reached up and yanked a sob from her, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. Thinking ceased, and feeling took over. And oh, the feelings she had thought were buried so deep, anger, hurt, fear, grief, sorrow. The sorrow was the worst of them, because it was the one that couldn't be controlled. She had known that almost from the very beginning. It was the one that would never let her go if she ever let it to the surface. And now it was here, dragging her down into its undercurrent, yanking at her with a grip that said it would never let her go. Another sob wrenched free, and Maggie had the horrible sensation that she was drowning in the grief. Her knees went weak beneath her, and the only reason she was still standing was because he was holding her up. "Shh," he said, and she realized he was stroking her hair. "Shh." His hand on her hair felt so good, so soothing. His arm around her felt like strength itself. Every rational part of her said she should pull away, that he was going to think she was a complete idiot. But her legs wouldn't move and her body felt shaky and weak. Tired washed through her spirit, taking rational thought with it. She let her will melt into the fatigue. Life itself slipped away from her grasp, and she let go and watched it leave. They were gone. They were really gone. And they were never, ever coming back. Her grief gave way to a blank numbness as she sniffed and wiped at the tears. She pulled in air in short little gasps and sniffs. Still, he didn't let her go. "Come on," he said softly, and she nodded. Why, she didn't know. All she knew was that here, with him, she was safe. He would take care of life while she was unable to. That thought was comforting, although she couldn't really put it all into words as to just why. His arm never left her as he guided her out the door and down the hallway to the living room. Once there, he sat down with her on the couch. She leaned into him, her grief overspilling its banks again. He didn't question it. He just held her until this spasm, too, had passed. "Do you know what I remember?" she asked, and it was as if she didn't feel any need to start at the beginning. "What's that?" "I remember waking up the next morning and wondering why they hadn't come." She shook her head. "I don't even remember the night before. I've tried, but I really don't remember them leaving. I was going to stay at a friend's house, so it really wasn't a big deal. But I remember waking up on that couch the next morning and wondering why I was still there and not in my bed." She let out a soft laugh. "It's weird. I can still picture that room. Man, it's like it was yesterday. It was yellow, not like a bright yellow, but a really pale mustard yellow, and the curtains were white, so there was this really intense kind of light everywhere. It's weird, because I thought for a moment I must be in heaven, and then I realized I wasn't." Her mind let the memories come freely. She felt no need to edit them. "I laid there for like the longest time trying to figure out why I wasn't in my bed. I don't know that I had ever not waked up in my bed, so it was weird, you know? And then I remembered they were supposed to come get me. They'd told me 11 or something like that. But here it was morning, and they still weren't there to get me." She squinted into the memories, trying to pull them up, but they'd been buried so long it was difficult. "I don't know if I even knew something was wrong at that point or not. I just thought there must have been a mix-up." Her heart snagged on the next memory. "But when I walked into that kitchen and Mrs. Davidson was sitting at that table," she let out the memory in a slow exhale. "When she looked at me." Maggie had to take a breath on the memory of the woman, her eyes red and tear-stained. That look, that one look had changed her life. Everything happened so fast after that. There were all these people around and everyone was talking all quiet. I really didn't understand what was going on, just that I was alone and Mom and Dad weren't there. And then even the other people left. They all left." She stopped. Thoughts that had been there her whole life, although she had never said them out loud, came through her. "You know, I've always wondered what would have happened if he'd have left 2 minutes later. Just 2 minutes. Everything would have been so different." "Your dad?" asked Keith, and the sound of his voice surprised her. She jerked her head up and then lowered it because she was having too much trouble dealing with the past to deal with the present, too. No. In a strange way, she had never thought about the fact that her parents could have left later. Somehow, that had never occurred to her. They were right where they should have been. It was the other guy who shouldn't have been there. The guy that hit them. Keith absorbed that blow. For no real reason, he had never realized there was another driver involved. It was his fault? On his chest, she nodded. He was drunk. The breath he had been taking vanished. In its absence, 100,000 pieces of things she had told him and things she hadn't fell into place. He wanted to say something, but nothing would come. Her world had been ripped apart by someone else's thoughtlessness, and in the next second, the understanding of how many times that could have been him smashed into him. How many times had he told his friends he was perfectly fine to drive, when the reality was he really wasn't? How many bars had he left, never thinking of whose life was between him and home? Too many, that was for sure. So, do you know what happened? She was shaking a little, cold he suspected, so he reached over and pulled the little throw blanket from the couch edge. Gently he put it around her, the blanket sliding easily over the soft blue material of her robe. Once it was there, he slid his hand up and down her arm for reassurance that he was still there. He ran a stop sign, she said softly. There were no skid marks at all. They were both killed instantly. It was just a mess of smashed metal when it was over. Nothing recognizable at all. So you saw the car? Inexplicably, she shook her head. That's what everybody said, but they never took me to see it. Her voice sounded hollow, as if there was no feeling beneath the memories. It's so weird. I've gone through that night 1,000,000 times in my head. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd try to picture the accident. Who was there, how dark it was, the lights, the sounds. I don't know. It's like if I could find something that could have been changed, something that didn't add up, it would bring them back like it never happened. Like if I could somehow find some evidence that God had overlooked, that he would have to reverse his decision and let them come back. She exhaled at that thought. Pretty stupid, huh? No, you're just trying to make some sense out of something that doesn't make any sense. The hollowness returned to her voice and her breathing. He was supposed to get time. She squinted into the memories. Manslaughter something, but he paid his way out of it. Once again, Keith's breathing snagged on the statement. He walked away? She nodded. Just like I did, only I never got over it. Her hand pulled the robe's belt out slowly and then let it drop. I wonder if he ever did. The story wound through Keith, pulling up memories as it went. That's why you drove Greg home. Huh? Her head moved, and this time she sat up, although she swayed with a movement. Now, looking at her sitting there was so much he wanted to say, but no real way to say it all. He told me about the other night, how you took him home. Her gaze dropped to the carpet. She tried to crush the feelings flooding through her face back down. I didn't want... She put her hand to her nose to stop the tears. Soft gentleness for the courage she showed in the face of such a struggle drifted through him. He reached over and laid his hand on her back. I know. She looked back at him, and the tears overtook her again. It's just so unfair. I wish no other kid ever had to go through this. I wish I could make it so that every kid had a home and parents who cared. I hate it that any kid ever has to be afraid and alone. None of them deserve that. Keith watched her, and neither did you. Her tongue drifted under her top lip as she fought the tears, but they were too strong. Her face crumpled into the pain again, and she gasped the breath in. Gently, he reached over and pulled her back to his chest. She didn't fight it, and for that, he was glad. He wanted her to know he was here for her, that she could share her grief, and he would help her through it the best he could. Her cheek and hand rested on his chest, and he could feel her soft sobs. He wanted, with everything in him, to say something that would make it better, but what could he say? What could anyone say? It had all been said in one thoughtless, reckless act, by someone he would never know. "Thank you," she said softly. He tilted his head to be able to see her. "For what?" "For listening. I've never told anyone that before." Gratefulness for her trust in him drifted through him. He hugged her tighter and kissed the top of her hair. "Hey, I'll always be here for you, no matter what." When Maggie woke up the next morning, her heart still hurt, but in a different way now. Now it was with the undeniable understanding that she wasn't carrying this pain alone, and somehow, in some strange way, that helped. In the kitchen, she found him making eggs and sausage with Peter perched on the cabinet. "Good morning," she said, her happiness not a total facade, although she did have a headache. "Morning." Keith smiled at her and then grew serious. "How are you?" "Good," she nodded. "I could use some aspirin, though." "2 aspirin coming up." He reached into the cabinet above Peter. "Excuse me, Mr. Ayer." Peter giggled as Keith leaned him to the side and grabbed the bottle. He produced the aspirin and handed them to her. "There's orange juice in the refrigerator and milk on the table." She took the aspirins and grabbed a glass from the table to pour some milk. "How long have you been up?" "Since Peter knocked on my door at 6:15. Keith reached over and tickled his fellow chef. "We got up and played Mario." "Mario?" Maggie's displeasure slid through her. "Before breakfast?" "Not our fault some people sleep all day, huh, Peter?" "All day?" Maggie checked the clock. "It's 7:30. "Like I said," Keith grinned at her wickedly, "if you're not up at the crack of dawn, we're wasting daylight, as Ike would say." Maggie knew he hadn't meant them to sting, but the words did anyway. She pulled her robe around her a little tighter. "Well, I'm going to go get ready and get Izzy up, unless you need a woman's help to finish this." "A woman?" Keith asked Peter. "We don't need no stinking woman, do we?" Although she was sure Peter didn't fully understand the comment, he grinned and shook his head anyway. "Fine," she said, flouncing on the word. "But if you burn down the house, don't come whining to me." "How many times have we cooked eggs and never needed her help?" Keith asked Peter, as Maggie walked to the hallway. "Now she thinks we're going to burn the place down without her? Huh, like we would do that." Maggie laughed. He was crazy. It seemed Keith could spend hours with her, and no matter how many there had been, he always wanted just a few more. "Want to go eat?" he asked after church. "No, we're probably pushing our luck. We'd better get home." He nodded. He knew that as well as she did, but still, he wanted to find some way to stave off her leaving, some excuse for her to stay. "You want to go riding today?" Her gaze was softly apologetic. "We better put in some FaceTime at the mansion, or someone's going to get suspicious." Suspicious of what, he didn't really know or care. All he cared about was that she was leaving, and there was nothing he could do about it. "I'll get Pete," Keith said, sliding out. "I can get it," Maggie said quickly. She grabbed the suitcases and blankets. If she could just get away from him without letting him know she didn't want to leave, somehow she could go on with life as if the last night had never happened. "You can get it?" He laughed at her. "Yeah, and I'm Houdini." He slid Peter to the ground. "Down you go, buddy. Go help Maggie with the pillows." Maggie gave him one, but it dragged the ground. She had to check her heart rate as Keith came to her side carrying Peter's car seat to get Isabella out. Amazingly, he managed to snap the second car seat out with Isabella planted on his hip. They started up the walk, laden with kids and equipment. "You know, for 2 little kids, you guys sure don't travel light." "You think this is bad? You should see their rooms." Maggie's gaze slid back to him as she opened the kitchen door and they walked in. He laughed, then his gaze traced past her, and the smile fell. "Oh, good morning," he said, visibly straightening, and Maggie knew it was bad even before she turned around. Gathering her courage, she turned slowly. It was worse than she ever could have imagined. She fought to find her own smile, which had evaporated as thoroughly as his had. "Mr. Ayer, Mrs. Ayer, good morning." Mr. Ayer was the first to get anything out. "Would someone like to explain this?" "I'm sorry, sir," Maggie started. "Patty Ann said that you all were not to be disturbed last night, so we—" "We?" he asked, looking at Keith. Well, she glanced back at Keith, who stood staring at his father. "I mentioned to Keith that we weren't really invited, and—" "That did not give you the right to take our children out of the house without our permission," Mrs. Ayer said. Maggie deflated. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't think it would be a problem if we just went to Keith's. I told Inez." "And thus we haven't called out the National Guard," Mr. Ayer said. "But we are still not pleased that you didn't tell us where you were going. We do not appreciate our children being taken just anywhere. Who knows what could have happened to them?" "But we weren't just anywhere. We were at Keith's." She looked back at him, but his face was rock hard. "I should go," he said. He smiled at her, kind of, handed Isabella to her, and then he dropped the other stuff to the floor and shoved through the kitchen door with a bang. The last she saw of him was that familiar stride, stomping down the walk. To say she didn't understand anything at all about the situation would have been an understatement. However, understanding wasn't going to help her much anyway. She turned back to face the wrath of people she had no real way of placating. "I'm really sorry. We would have been back earlier, but we went to church." That seemed to stop Mr. Ayer. His face dropped into incomprehension. "Church? You went to church?" "Yeah." She felt Peter at her knee, and she reached down to shield him from any ugliness. Her heart was pounding in fear, and she was sure his was too. "Keith's been taking me sometimes. Not all the time, just a few times. I know we should have told you that too. I'm sorry." Mr. Ayer's gaze surveyed her in a way she couldn't quite read. "Keith went to church?" She wasn't sure what the right answer to that question was, so she tried the honest one. "Yes." "And you've taken the children?" Mrs. Ayer asked, clearly furious. "Yes, ma'am." That was it. She was fired. She was sure of it. "I do not believe this," Mrs. Ayer said, standing. "Miss Montgomery—" "Vivian." Mr. Ayer's hand on her wrist stopped her, and she looked down in consternation. With a gaze heavy with haze, he looked up at his wife. "May I speak with you?" He glanced at Maggie and the kids. "Privately?" Mrs. Ayer didn't look at all happy, and it took her a long time to answer. "Fine." They walked out. It would have been nice to be relieved, but Maggie couldn't get all the way there. True, she hadn't been fired outright, but it was less than clear that she wouldn't be when they came back. Seconds turned to minutes, then she heard the whimper. Peter. Carefully she spun right where she had been standing. She sat on her heel and hugged him to her. "Hey, baby, shh, it's okay."
Where did Keith go?
Peter rubbed his eyes, and she knew it was getting time for lunch and a nap. "Keith had to go home, sweetheart." At least she hoped that was where he had gone. She pulled Peter to her again, and as she kissed his hair, her gaze went through the window in the kitchen door to the outside. The pickup was long gone. He was upset. The bang of the door had told her that, and it was bad. The look on his face told her that. She wished she could somehow turn back time and start over. She shouldn't have asked him to help her. She should have made the best of it at the mansion. "Ms. Montgomery," Mr. Ayer said, striding into the room. Mrs. Ayer followed him, her arms folded at her chest. Maggie stood and waited for the death sentence to be pronounced. "We are not happy that you did not inform us you had taken the children. But," he paused as his gaze went to his children, "we believe you had their best interest at heart." His gaze leveled back on her. "In the future, we expect you to inform us where the children will be at all times." "Okay." She shouldn't have had any courage left, but to her heart, This was important. "We have gone riding a couple of times at the stables and to church. Will those be acceptable if I tell Patty Ann where we're going?" Mr. Ayer looked like she had punched him. "So long as you tell Patty Ann." Mrs. Ayer didn't look at all pleased, but he turned and ushered her out before she could take a whack at Maggie. When they were gone, Maggie finally took a breath. "Come on, you two. We'd better get you ready for lunch." She was gone. Of that much Keith was certain. He should have been smart enough to nix the idea of them coming to his place when it first came up. Of course his father would never approve of them going to his place. That thought knifed through his heart. He loved those kids, and to be treated as if he wasn't good enough to be around them hurt. He tried to find something to do at his place, but after an hour of frustration, he decided it would be best to go get some work done. He pulled on his faded blue jeans and grabbed a sleeveless shirt. If she was gone, what was the point of wanting to be here? He might as well move to the Woodlands now and get it over with. That thought brought him up short. He'd never called the realtor as Dallas had told him to. Frustration at being treated like a 3-year-old no matter where he went crawled through him. It was like none of them cared what he thought. They knew what was best. He was supposed to follow along. At the stables, he noticed Tanner's beat-up pickup, but Ike's was nowhere to be seen. That was a relief. At least he wouldn't have to go more rounds with the newest manager. Keith stalked into the stables and met Tanner, who was tossing hay to the horses. "Oh, good afternoon, Mr. Ayer. I didn't know you were scheduled today." "The house was getting to me." "Tell me about it," Tanner said. "My roommates were getting on my nerves." "The silence was getting on mine." At that moment, a blonde-headed young lady stepped out of the office. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know there was anybody else here." Keith stopped and looked at her, trying to fit her into a logical place. It wasn't until Tanner walked over to her and laid his arm around her that Keith figured it out. "Mr. Ayer, this is my girlfriend, Jamie. Jamie, this is Mr. Ayer." Keith held out his hand. "Keith, please." She smiled and shook his hand. "I'm sorry. I was just helping Tanner so we could go out tonight." When Keith stepped back and surveyed her, it was clear that she was indeed in work clothes. "I didn't think you would mind," Tanner said, and the strain of apprehension was evident. Happiness for them drifted through him. They were lucky to be together without a million things standing in their way. "I don't mind. Glad to have you aboard, Jamie." "Thank you, Mr. Ayer." She caught his look. "Keith." "The interview is Thursday," Dallas said that evening as Keith's real life crashed in around him. 10 a.m. You should email me your resume so I can go over it." "I know how to do a resume." He sat at the table over his dinner that was already cold. Eating didn't sound appealing. Living didn't even sound appealing. Finally, he stood and took his dish and the phone to the sink. "Still, you haven't had much practice with things like this," Dallas said. "I'd hate for you to mess up this chance. It's such an incredible opportunity." "I won't mess it up, Dallas." "I didn't mean mess it up, like be an idiot, but you have to understand these companies are not your father. They aren't going to overlook the details." "What details about me do they need to overlook?" Frustration seeped through him. "You know what I mean, Keith. You don't exactly have an extensive history outside your father's influence." That would have been a challenge. "I worked all while I was in college, and I was the manager for the racing operation here from the time I graduated. We've turned out a profit on the racing every single year, and this year our revenues are on pace to double." Dallas sounded less than impressed. "That's good for a hobby, but a real company—" "Listen, Dallas, I've got things to get done." "But we haven't even talked about the house. Did you call Jane at the realtor office? She needed to know what our offer would be." "What is our offer going to be?" "Well, that depends if we go through the bank or if your dad will underwrite us." Keith scratched his head. "We'd better go with the bank. I don't really want to be tied to family if at all possible." Her side went quiet. "It's going to be hard for us to do it on our own, with neither of us having a real job yet." "I have a real job." "You know what I mean. The bank needs something more solid than what we plan to do. Are you sure you can't ask your dad? That would really help." "I'll see what I can do." "Have you talked to him about the jet?" Dallas asked. "I talked to Rachel, and she might catch a ride with us." "Who's Rachel?" "Oh, a friend from Advanced Legal Theory. She lives in Tennessee." "But we'd be coming to Texas." "Well, yeah, but Tennessee's right on the way." "Right?" Keith was having trouble breathing. Dallas seemed to take it for granted that not only was whatever hers, but that apparently included whatever was his father's as well. "We're going to have to talk about this whole plane thing." "Oh, Keith, I'm sorry. Heather just showed up. We're going to dinner. Ristorante Rapucci." He had no idea what Ristorante Rapucci was, but the fact that she pointed it out must mean it was expensive and meant to impress him. "Oh, okay." "I'll talk to you tomorrow night." "Oh, good. Something to look forward to." "See ya." And they signed off. When Keith hung up, it was like dropping a 50-pound pack. He sat down on the couch with a thump. He wiped his hand over his face, trying to block out the last 24 hours, but that wasn't easy. Her on the couch, in his arms, reliving a nightmare he wished she had never been through. Then, this morning in the mansion's kitchen, why was it, even when he helped, they found a way to throw him to the ground and then kick him in the gut? Dallas was right. He needed to call the realtor. He needed to get out of here before they permanently killed his spirit and everything he'd ever managed to put together underneath him. As he stood and headed for the back, he wondered if she was gone. Probably. And, with everything in him, he tried to convince himself that was for the best.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.